Okay, so then for Mill on higher and lower pleasures, of course, you're going to go to your Smart Book reading and go to where you see the section on Mill. And you'll want to see what he says about higher and lower pleasures. What is an what is a higher pleasure to Mill? What might be an example of a higher pleasure? What are lower pleasures? What's an example of a lower pleasure? What is his position on higher and lower pleasures? Why does he think it's important to make the distinction? Also, in studying and reading again what Mill had to say about higher and lower pleasures, what does that show in terms of a difference with Bentham? And again, you're going to get that, of course, in the section on Mill in the reading. When it comes to his concept of how we should balance the distribution of happiness, I want you to see what the author has to say here. Over here, it says this is still in the Mill section of utilitarianism, but it's like a little subsection within the Mill section. So look here to see what he says about like who should be the focus of maximizing happiness, to what extent, what's the scope of it. And this will give you another way in which Mill is said to have a difference in terms of emphasis and iteration in terms of happiness and what and whom and to what extent you should be concerned about other individuals. So just keep a mind on the fact that as you read through Bentham actually and get information about this, and you read through Mill and get information about this, that you will be getting the major differences between Mill and Bentham. And Lawhead often points out explicitly that, hey, Mill agrees with this part of Bentham, but not so much this part, or Bentham doesn't seem to stress such and such as much as Mill does. So in the entire Mill section, you are going to find some main differences, including their ideas about how you should think about whose happiness you are focused on and to what extent. So focus on that there. Relation of principle to action and time. So this, what I'm thinking of here, comes after the Mill part, and it has to do with applying the principle of utility. That's what I'm talking about here. What are the implications for a principle of utility, given that it's a consequentialist theory, in terms of an actions being right in one context throughout space and time in all contexts? So I want you to look at that. And for that part, you're going to probably want to look in this section where it says utilitarianism, objectivism, or relativism. So look at that part and see if you can figure out what it is that I want you to know from that section there. And then know what Norcross has to say on sacrifice as it relates to the concepts of convenience, innocence, human life. How does Norcross connect the concept of sacrifice to convenience, to innocence, or human life? Or what does he have to say about each of these concepts? And so Norcross is a contemporary utilitarian. So, Mill and Bentham were older utilitarians, but here is an excerpt from Norcross, and you get an introduction to it. Notice that it says the consequences of consequentialism, a test case. So this is where you would want to go to get an introduction to Norcross and his philosophy. There's some original text. I suggest you do read that original text and then, go through this to get a good sense of how he connects these ideas, highlight these ideas as you're reading. In the Smart Book and the ebook, you can highlight stuff. Okay, so now let's go to Kantian ethics. This might be the most challenging section. Kant is a very complex theory, and I usually spend the most, not just complex, but obtuse and very difficult to understand. For a lot of people, it's counterintuitive until they get it explained to them. But in my face-to-face class, I do spend a lot of time on him, not because I think he's more important necessarily or better, but because his theory is much harder to understand. But these are the things that I want you to focus on. I already said what I mean by categorizations of theory earlier in another video. So what is the basis of theory? What does Kant base his theory on? Use of human psychology to ground theory. Does he think we should use facts about human psychology to ground theory? If so, what are they? If not, then what is the basis of his theory? Moral rules and exceptions. What does he have to say about moral rules and whether there can be exceptions? What role does God play in his theory, if any? And what is the concept of what he calls the goodwill? So that, of course, is going to be in the next chapter right here. And those items that I went over in terms of looking for information will start here. You can you can actually get a sense of one of the answers or get one of the answers here, but it's corroborated by what he says later about Kant here. Read this, go ahead and read this, because I definitely make use of something that the author says here to test your understanding of Kant with respect to his moral theory. And then you're going to want to take a look in here for information about the bulleted items that I've already read through in the study guide for Kant. Oh, and then here's the goodwill. So remember, the study guide, most of it follows the order of the reading. Sometimes there are things that are not in a particular place where, not necessarily in order, but that's 90 to 80% of the stuff is in order of the reading. So initial meaning of maxim. So you get an initial introduction to maxim. And so make sure you take a look at that one. You're going to get another definition for maxim. It's not that the definition for maxim that you get later on is inconsistent. They're the same. The definitions are for the same concept. You just get kind of like a more technical definition for maxim after Kant begins to talk. After Lawhead begins to talk about hypothetical, or as he's beginning to talk about hypothetical and categorical imperatives in particular. Lawhead's initial introduction to Kant's concept of a maxim is within the subsection of the goodwill, but you have to read a little bit past this peach or rusty colored text box to find the initial introduction to his concept of a maxim, his initial introduction. Then we have here the proper alignment between an action and doing one's duty. So that is a really important distinction to look through. And for this, really for the Kant part, you're just going to have to reread the text very carefully, all of the words. And so what you want to do is make sure you read even this part very carefully. Look at this part. These are really guiding questions that are going to help you with this bullet point. And the idea that you want to focus on here is what does it take for an action to have moral praise, or to be morally praiseworthy? So again, what does it take for an action or an agent who conducts the action to be morally praiseworthy with respect to duty? So Kant is going to give some examples of actions that are done, and he's going to talk about why they are or are not morally praiseworthy. And keep in mind that an action can be done such that it aligns with duty for Kant, but that doesn't mean that it's morally praiseworthy. So make sure you read through Kant's discussion of this in his own text, but also Lawhead's discussion of the different kinds of actions and scenarios where people might say that somebody's morally praiseworthy or that their actions are morally praiseworthy, but they're not according to Kant. There's only one example that he gives, or there's really one very narrow conception of when something is morally praiseworthy, and you need to find that in the reading. Okay, so then he's going to go on, after he's done discussing that, to introduce you to the hypothetical and categorical imperative. And you're going to find that around page 488, around page 489. It's going to be after a little excerpt that is labeled or subheaded the second proposition of morality. And so start looking in here. You can see it says hypothetical imperative, categorical imperative. So read carefully through here at the remainder of the chapter to get information about these concepts. Also, make sure in redoing the reading that you look at what Lawhead has to say for Kant in terms of the basis of the categorical imperative. In other words, what is grounding the categorical imperative? Upon what does it rest? And what must be true of its application? What are the steps necessary to apply the categorical imperative? And what are the criteria the application has to meet? Know of some examples and outcomes for applying the categorical imperative. Know about the second version of the categorical imperative and the value of a person versus non-persons. So when we talk about the second version, so this is the other version of the categorical imperative that I was just telling you about. It says the categorical imperative 2, persons as ends in themselves. Here, Lawhead is transitioning you from the first version to another version, or what's called the second formulation. So that's what I'm getting at right here when I say the second version of the categorical imperative. Focus on how that reads. How does the second version of the categorical imperative read, and then how does it connect to how Kant thinks about persons versus non-persons and values for things versus persons, and how does it connect to his categorical imperative. And then later in the reading, I want you to see what Lawhead has to say about Kant and what Kant has to say about lying and good consequences. That's going to be after his discussion of the second categorical imperative. Pay attention to this part right here, absolute duties all the way through to, and then you should be good to stop here. But you can get information there about lying and good consequences, but you can also make sure that you really understand what he has to say about moral rules and exceptions as well. All right, so with that said, the last thing that one more thing that I want you to know about is the definition. I should not say definitions, but definition and examples for how prima facie duty is used in the reading. That part is going to come in the same section as absolute duty. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you're going to start looking here for the stuff on prima facie duties. The meaning of prima facie duty, why does that concept exist, what problem was it meant to overcome, and what are some examples. All right, now we're finally ready to get to the last section. That's going to be Virtue Ethics 5.5. So let's go ahead and move forward with that. So categorizations of theory, of course, you already know about that. At the beginning of this section in Chapter 5, you've got a story that Lawhead presents from Michael Stoker. This is at the very beginning under leading questions, so make sure you look at that. Know what the gist of the story is. Why is Michael Stoker telling that story? What is it supposed to show about someone? Primary question for when. Okay, so this one is very important. What is the primary question for the virtue ethicist, and how does that compare to what the primary question is for a consequentialist like a utilitarian or a deontologist like Kant? So again, what is the primary question? You're going to get that in the leading questions section as well. Now we go to aspect with which utilitarians would agree and an aspect with which Kant would disagree. For that part, you are going to want to go to the problems with the utilitarian view in the Aristotle section. So here's where you can find an aspect with which utilitarians would agree. So even though it says in the virtue ethics section that you're going to see that, the topic in this part of the chapter on virtue ethics is attention to the problems with utilitarianism, you're still going to get information about something that the utilitarians agree with when it comes to virtue ethics. Here, so it's going to be somewhere here, somewhere in one of these paragraphs. The problems with the Kantian view, that's where you will get information with respect to an aspect with which Kant would disagree. All right, and then to focus in on Aristotle, so you get some information about virtue ethics and the most important question, what a utilitarian would agree with respect to virtue ethics, what Kant would disagree with respect to virtue ethics, and then you get your formal introduction by Lawhead to Aristotle later in the reading on page 507. So then you're going to want to know what Aristotle has to say about acquiring moral virtue. How do you acquire moral virtue? What disagreement does he have with Kant with respect to just action? So look at that, conditions of acting justly according to Aristotle. Know what he has to say about the doctrine of the mean. Know some examples for the doctrine of the mean and a counterexample. In other words, there's going to be there's going to be something. I want you to give me an example of something that Aristotle says there is no opposite. When it comes to these two bullets right here, I'll give you a little bit of help. You're going to want to look at page 510 and read these questions right here from Lawhead. They're very good for helping you. And then you're going to have to read the actual text. Go ahead and read the actual text, and then read what Lawhead has to say afterwards here about up here to get really important information about how Aristotle would disagree with Kant with respect to just action, and then to know what Aristotle's conditions are for acting justly. You're looking for 3 conditions, and it may be in the original text and not so much what Lawhead has to say, but I'll leave that to you to figure out. I know the answer, but I want you to get into it. And then there's not a lot of discussion by Lawhead of Aristotle with respect to the doctrine of the mean and examples, but go ahead and look at what he does present, including the original text from Aristotle. He starts to discuss the mean on page 510, and then gives you some questions to help you make sense of the original text. And so then you find a lot of original text here, and there's definitely going to be some information in here relative to a bullet point that you could very well see on a test. And then you might want to look at this and think about these concepts in relation to virtue ethics. And I'm sure you realize that when I've been talking about intellectual virtue, that I'm very much informed by Aristotle, but the way that I've been using intellectual virtue is from an epistemic standpoint. It has to do with what's called regulative epistemology. It's not about being moral, though sometimes I think it is also. But I'm not going to get into a whole lecture on that because it's just a 4-week course. So if we were in a longer course, a longer semester, I would circle back to epistemology and tie everything together in terms of, why I'm so into intellectual virtue, how my use of intellectual virtue goes with something called regulative epistemology and isn't one and the same thing as what Aristotle's referring to with the concepts or words intellectual virtue. But that is a long lecture, so I'm not going to put it out there. Just, go through the information here, go through the insights here to jot down important points that you need to know about these items here.